Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. Today's episode is about environmental justice, or EJ. Environmental justice is about the distribution of environmental impacts. It's about who gets the benefits from activities that degrade the environment, and above all, about who bears the costs, who bears the harms from things like pollution and resource depletion. And it's about how the distribution of those harms and benefits is correlated with other socioeconomic variables, correlated with things like income, race, and ethnicity. The earliest studies of environmental justice include one by Bob Bullard, who was at the time teaching in Houston and wrote about the distribution of hazardous waste sites in Metro Houston. And what he found was that when you looked at the map of where the sites were, and you looked at the map of where predominantly African American neighborhoods were located, there was a very visible and evident relationship between the two. More dumping of hazardous wastes in African American neighborhoods than on average in the metro area in Houston. Around the same time, the U.S. General Accounting Office, an arm of Congress, did a study of hazardous waste sites in EPA Region 4, that's the southeastern states in the U.S., and they found the same kind of relationship between where the waste sites are located and African American populations. And then a few years later, the United Church of Christ did the first national study. They looked at the level of zip codes and they asked, is there a relationship between where hazardous waste sites are located and the percentage of African Americans and other minorities in the population of that zip code region? And they found, yep, again, a correlation. Those kinds of correlation studies were then further bolstered, so to speak, by what was something of a smoking gun in terms of the possibility that environmental costs are being distributed in a non-random fashion in the United States. And this was a report called the Sorrell Report. It was produced by a consulting firm called Sorrell Associates for the California Waste Management Board. And it was advising the state of California about where to site what were euphemistically called waste-to-energy projects. Another name for those projects is incinerators. They were talking about where incinerators should be put. And in the report, which got leaked and exposed by environmental groups, the consultant said, political criteria have become every bit as important in determining the outcome of a project as engineering factors. A great deal of time, resources, and planning could be saved and political problems avoided if people who are resentful and people who are amenable to waste-to-energy projects could be identified before entering a site, before selecting a site. And how do we know which people are going to be resentful and which people are going to be amenable? Well, they said the people who are going to be resentful, the people we're going to have to worry about, those are the more affluent people in the society, the people with more power, the people who can make their voices heard. And so they said middle and higher socioeconomic strata neighborhoods should not fall within a 1 mile or 5 mile radius of the proposed site. Keep those incinerators away from the folks who are really going to cause you a lot of problems. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Except they're going to go somewhere. So where are they going to go? They're going to go to the communities that are less able to resist the incinerators. As the evidence of environmental injustice accumulated from studies about what actually happened and then revelations like that of the Sorrell Report, that decision makers were actually taking these things into account in their decision making. In the early 1990s, after President Clinton got elected, he issued an executive order, pushed to do so by environmental justice advocates around the country. And that was called Executive Order 12898. It was the presidential order to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. And in that order, which is still in force, federal agencies are directed to take steps to identify and rectify disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of their programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and low-income populations. And I want to draw your attention to one thing here. It's not just about race and ethnicity, it's about income. And the idea is that it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, what your ethnic background is, or how much money you've got. You have the same right to a clean and safe environment as anybody else. That's the foundation for environmental justice, and it's the foundation that was expressed in this presidential executive order back in 1994. Now, in the research on environmental injustice, the efforts to see where it's happening, how it's happening, why it's happening, there are a number of controversies that have come up. And I want to say a few words about each of those, or at least about some of the biggest ones. One has to do with the question of how near is near. If we talk about exposure to a hazardous waste site, if we're measuring that in terms of how far away you are from the site, how far is far and how near is near? How close do you have to be? You have to live right next door to it? How about if you live 200 yards away? What about a quarter mile? What about half a mile? How near is near? And studies that were done on this question back in the 1990s came up with the following interesting kind of relationship. That in the places where hazardous waste sites were located, the technical name for those is treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, or TSDFs, in the places where the TSDFs were located, and this was at a very fine level of spatial disaggregation, this was looking at census tracts, you found that if you looked at the percentage of Black or Hispanic or impoverished families, you found that in the places they were located, these were about average for their metro areas. They didn't have disproportionate numbers of minorities, but it turns out you also found out that hardly anybody lived in those places. Why? Because they were industrial zones. But as soon as you got just outside of those census tracts to the neighboring tracts, which are some of the most densely populated tracts in the cities, you found disproportionately high numbers of African Americans, Latinos, people living below the federal poverty line, households receiving public assistance, etc. By whatever measure you used of socioeconomic status, you found that there was a lot of disproportionate exposure if you reckon that being just outside the census tract where the hazard was located counts as near enough to be affected. But there is debate about how near is near, and you can get different results depending on how you drew your circles around the hazards and counted the people inside those circles. So one of the ways in which the research has advanced some over the years is that researchers have been able to not only look at proximity, where you got this question of how big a circle to draw, how near is near, but they've been able to look at exposure. They've been able to look at actually how much exposure do people get to air pollution, for example, taking into account smokestack heights, exit gas velocities, prevailing wind patterns, breakdown patterns of the chemicals in the environment, and so on. And that ability to move from simple proximity to exposure has enhanced in many ways the accuracy of the studies that we can do on environmental injustice, environmental disparities. Here's some results from such a study based on exposure. This looks at industrial air toxics in the United States. And here's some data by region, showing for each region, each of the 10 EPA regions, how the exposure varies between non-poor white folks who are above the federal poverty line, poor white folks, non-poor minorities, and poor minorities. So we break the population here into these four groups, and we say, hey, is there any difference in their exposure to industrial air toxics? Now, if you believed that it's totally random where pollution hazards fall, what you'd expect is everybody has exactly the same level of exposure. You wouldn't expect to see any real systematic patterns. And yet we do see systematic patterns, particularly in the areas where the exposure levels are highest. So the EPA region with the highest exposure to industrial air toxics, in terms of average per capita exposures, is the Midwest. And in that region, what do we see? The highest levels of exposure, poor minorities. Second highest, non-poor minorities. Third highest, poor whites. Least exposure, non-poor whites. You see an environmental justice gradient in which both income and race and ethnicity matter. And it turns out, in the Midwest at least, that race and ethnicity matter even more than income. Even non-poor minorities have higher exposures than poor whites. What about when we go to the second region, the region with the second highest level of exposure? That's the south central region of the United States. What do we see there? Same pattern, not quite as stark as in the Midwest, but again, highest exposure amongst poor minorities, second highest, non-poor minorities, third, poor whites, and the least exposure among non-poor whites. That pattern doesn't happen everywhere. There are some regional differences in the United States, and it's interesting to look at the third highest level of exposure by region in the mid-Atlantic states. And here what we find is actually a different pattern. We find that income matters a lot still, but racially things get turned around. We have the highest exposure among poor whites, and non-poor minorities, they have the lowest exposure. So there's some interesting regional differences, and it's interesting to think about what's going on in the mid-Atlantic states that results in that different pattern. Maybe cities that have more industrial activity have more white folks. It's something that'd be worth looking into. But the point here is that when we look at the national picture, we find pretty systematic evidence that exposure is not equal. Some of you may know the song by Bob Marley in which he sang, "When the rain falls, it don't fall on one man's house." Well, pollution isn't like rain. When pollution falls, it doesn't fall equally on everybody's house. Some folks get more of it than other folks. Second question that I want to spend a minute or two on is think about why this happens, why we get these disproportionate impacts on low-income people and people of color in so many parts of the country. And that raises the question of which came first. Was it that these were low-income neighborhoods and predominantly minority neighborhoods, and firms or governments decided this is the place we're going to site a bunch of hazardous stuff? Or was it the case that those siting decisions were made totally neutrally, randomly, and the result was that property values changed and richer people moved out, poor people moved in? This is called the siting versus move-in controversy. And it's an example of the phrase that you'll encounter often in social science, that correlation does not prove causation. Just because we see a correlation between demographic variables like race and income and the presence of hazards or exposure to hazards doesn't mean that we know exactly why that happened. We can say there's a correlation. Correlations pose a question about what the cause is. They don't answer that question, right? If we see a correlation between A and B, it could be that A caused B, it could be that B caused A, it could be that both of them were caused by something else, C. It could be a combination of all of those. All those could help to explain the correlation. So when we're thinking about the correlation between demographic variables and environmental hazards, we can ask, well, is it that people were vulnerable, politically vulnerable? They had lower purchasing power, lower political power, and that led to the siting of the hazard in their midst? Or was it the case that the siting of the hazard changed the demographics of the surrounding community, changed property values, caused move in and move out? Well, the siting logic is the logic that was expressed in that Sorrell report that I mentioned earlier, the idea that political criteria have become every bit as important as engineering criteria in determining the outcome of a project. And those political criteria should get taken into account in siting decisions. The move-in logic is based on purchasing power, not so much on political power. It's that, hey, you have an undesirable thing that's suddenly been sited in your community, property values go down, people who can afford it move out, people who want that cheap housing are willing to take the risk of living next to a hazard and they move in. That's the logic. It's based on income. And if that was all that was going on, was that purchasing power logic, one might look at it and say, well, maybe, that's just people making their choices. And the problem here is not where the things are sited. The problem is income disparities, and if we want to do anything about it, we have to do something about those. But if income was the only thing that was going on, if we statistically controlled for income and said, well, of people with the same income, does it matter if you're black or white, if you're Latino or Anglo, where you live, controlling for income? Turns out, when you control for income, it still matters a lot. The racial disparities, the ethnic disparities in terms of proximity and exposure to hazards are really large, even controlling for income. And so what that suggests is that if something's going on the move-in side, where it's not just based on property values and purchasing power anymore, but there's also a disproportionate move-in by people of color, then something's happening in housing markets and mortgage markets that involves racial and ethnic discrimination that's channeling certain people into more hazardous neighborhoods. So what the causes are behind the correlation is really important to understand in terms of understanding what we should do about it. Now, it's difficult to tease out what that causality is, because to do it, you need to have data over time. You need to know when these things were cited, how the demography changed. Those are complicated kinds of analyses to make. The data to do it aren't easily available, and so there hasn't been enough research on that yet. But let me mention one of the first studies that really carefully and systematically looked at this question. It was done in Metro Los Angeles by a researcher named Manuel Pastor and his colleagues. And what they looked at was the location of TSDFs, those toxic storage and disposal facilities, in Los Angeles County between 1970 and 1990, the hazardous waste dumps. And their conclusions, by looking at when these things were cited and what the demography was before and after, was that there was only weak evidence for the move-in hypothesis along racial and ethnic lines, but that there was very strong evidence that what they called demographics reflecting political weakness were good predictors of where these hazardous waste sites would be located. What are those kinds of demographics? Race, ethnicity. And in fact, above all, what they found was that neighborhoods that are undergoing a process of switchover from being predominantly African American to predominantly Latino were particularly vulnerable, because they hypothesized those communities had less political power to resist the siting of these hazards in their midst. One last thing that I want to mention. One might think that environmental injustice means that the hazards get disproportionately located in low-income communities, disproportionately located in communities with larger numbers of racial and ethnic minorities. So maybe it's good for some people. The white folks, it's good for. The people who are more affluent, it's good for, right? The hazards are going into other people's neighborhoods. So we investigated that in a study called Is Environmental Justice Good for White Folks? And we found something kind of interesting. We divided up metropolitan areas in the United States into those with really high discrepancies in the share of environmental exposure. This was to industrial air toxics borne by racial and ethnic minorities, and the share borne by whites. And we compared levels of exposure in places with high disparity and low disparity. And of course, what we found for minorities, it's not surprising, we found that places with high disparity, that's the relatively light line here, those places, the minority people had much higher exposures to toxics than places with low disparities. But what's really interesting here is that when you looked at the situation for white folks, you found that exposures for white folks were also higher in the places where you had more disparity. In places where there was less racial disparity, white folks were less exposed, as well as minorities. And so it makes you think, maybe this kind of disparity that we're talking about here is not actually good for anybody. Of course, it's especially bad for the people who are on the receiving end of the environmental hazards. And the environmental justice movement is the effort of people in communities and neighborhoods around the country and around the world to combat disproportionate exposure to environmental harms that are based on the race, ethnicity, or income of the populations affected. And the underlying foundation for those struggles is the basic principle that we all have an equal right to a clean and safe environment. Thanks very much.